I'll
And
tell you. Um, there was an American researcher named um, Dr. David Sinclair who studied addiction. And when he found out about this alcohol dependent strain of rats in Finland, he decided to move to Finland to carry out some of his experiments on these rats. And his hypothesis was that an opiate antagonist, an opiate blocker like naltrexone or naloxone, which they use for overdoses with opiate addicts, or nalmefene, would stop somebody from compulsively using a substance or doing an activity, and that person would actually unlearn the addiction. And that is sort of, if you remember the experiment that Pavlov did with the dog, by ringing the bell and then feeding the dog salivates, and then the dog stopped salivating once there wasn't food after the bell was rung. He unlearned the habit of salivating, the activity of salivating. So Dr. Sinclair did all these experiments of giving these rats, these alcohol dependent rats that were multiple generations of dependency. They were bred to be alcoholic. So he would give them full on use of the alcohol. They could press the lever and get as much alcohol as they wanted. And then he would take the alcohol away. And then he would give it back to them after he would give them an opiate blocker. And he noticed that the rats would just become disinterested in the alcohol when they had the opiate blocker in their bodies. The alcohol was there, but they weren't drinking it. So this was a huge, huge win for him. And he started, obviously they started doing human experiences, and Finland ended up using the Sinclair method for decades as the number one treatment for alcohol misuse. And it was extremely successful. The treatment itself has a 78% long-term success rate, and all it involves is taking this generic, FDA-approved, non-addictive, it doesn't promote pleasure, you can't get addicted to it, no one's ever overdosed on it. It's an opiate blocker. You take that 1 hour prior to the first drink of the day. So that's naltrexone. FDA approved it for the use for alcoholism. However, the way they approved it is daily with abstinence. And that doesn't target the behavior you want to stop or decrease. So if your goal is to go from a bottle of wine to 1 glass of wine, that's harm reduction. You would take naltrexone an hour before you drink your wine, every time you drink. And over the course of a few months, you would reduce down to your 1 glass, or for a lot of people, you just quit, like I did. It took me 9 years, but eventually I just went, I'm done. And I never would have reached that without naltrexone. I know that. I mean, I tried everything, rehab, AA, therapy, you name it, hypnotherapy, nothing worked for me. I found it in 2009 after I relapsed for yet another time. I was a very light drinker in my 20s, and in my 30s, I was a social drinker. And then in my late 30s, early 40s, I developed a problem because I made myself stop drinking. And that caused what's known as the alcohol deprivation effect. That's when you see people craving and white knuckling. And the next time I drank, I didn't stop. So I went from being like drinking too much to drinking nothing to becoming a binge drinker. It switched something in my brain, which happens to a lot of people. It's this deprivation effect. It's the same thing as when people go on a diet and then they fall off the diet and they eat 5,000 calories that day, because you've been depriving your body of it and you just become compulsive about food. So this is what happens to a lot of people with alcohol use disorder. When I found it, it was random. I asked my doctor for the prescription. He refused me. I ended up having to order the medication online, and I made a vow to myself that I would never, ever allow anybody else to have to go through that. It was demeaning. It was, in my opinion, it was malpractice. This is a safe, FDA-approved, life-saving medication, and he refused to give it to me. And I mean, just the courage to come to your doctor and say, I have a drinking problem. Mm-hmm. And then he refuses you this thing. It was enraging. So I managed to get the medication, and then I found a physician locally who was willing to give it to me after I proved to him that I've been taking it for 4 months, online, and it's reduced my drinking to normal levels. And so now he handles everybody in Hollywood who wants to go on TSM. So I created a little niche business for him. Anyway, my nonprofit now has providers in the entire United States. The whole country is covered. We have telemedicine or inpatient, in-office doctors that will support you doing the Sinclair method. So it's a huge difference from 2009 until now. When you said, I've never heard of it, the majority of people have not heard about it. And that is because of the prevalence of 12-step mentality and abstinence. We are an abstinence-based culture. Either you do it or you don't. Harm reduction is really not embraced in this country, which is a huge shame, because if you can reduce drinking down to safe drinking levels, you're not going to have the deaths, you're not going to have the lost days of work, you're not going to have people, beating up their children and spouses. It would make a huge reduction in the harm that alcohol misuse causes this country, not to mention the $250 billion a year it costs us. So harm reduction is very viable. And as I said, almost a quarter of people on the Sinclair method go abstinent, or more than a quarter. Yeah, so that's basically TSM in a nutshell. You take the medication only when you drink, and if you quit drinking, you never have to take it again.